I'd like to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Dave Rajewski, and I run the Science and Technology Innovation Program here. I'd also like to welcome an old friend, Dick Sclove, and also Paul Stern from the National Research Council. You should have bios for both Dick and Paul when you came in. I thought what I would do is start with some impressionistic snapshots of technology assessment, or at least my interactions with them. In 1995, I got a message that they were shutting down the Office of Technology Assessment in the Congress. And I remember being bewildered, perplexed, and shocked. Not necessarily in that order, but certainly all three things. And I guess my response was, this has got to be a mistake and somebody's going to fix it. And of course, there wasn't any significant corrective action. After the OTA closed down, we went on to complete the Decade of the Brain. We finished sequencing the human genome. We obviously built out the World Wide Web. We launched and put billions of dollars into nanotech research. And so the science and technology continued to advance, but not necessarily our ability to assess the impacts, at least not in the US. And I think the interesting thing that happened was a lot of the methodological innovation, a lot of the practice of technology assessment moved to Europe and Scandinavia. So you had this constant kind of popping out of the ground of technology assessment units across most of Europe and Scandinavia right after OTA essentially went away. And most of those early on had actually been modeled on the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. So if we fast forward 10 years, my mood had changed to one of sort of utmost pessimism. I really didn't think it was going to be possible to bring back OTA. I actually commissioned a paper then on the future of technology assessment, which also wasn't very optimistic. About that time, we started the project on nanotechnologies here. And when we were trying to structure the project, I felt that it was interesting to kind of look at what the Europeans were doing and try to build in a component that was constantly coming in contact with the public. So actually, the first thing that we did when we launched the nanotech project was we ran around the country and held focus groups. Not inside the Beltway. We were in Dallas, Texas. We were in Cleveland, Ohio. We were in Spokane, Washington. And I think that the impression I had, which has just been confirmed again and again since we do these focus groups all the time, was there was an incredible appetite on the part of the public to get involved in essentially in this discussion about science and technology. We heard that again and again. We really want to be involved. We'd like to have some opportunities for input. And the other message, which was somewhat a little bit more offensive, was we don't think the government should be making these kinds of decisions without our involvement. That came through again and again. The other thing that was quite interesting was their ability, based on very small amounts of information, to sort of pick apart and identify really hard issues. So there was a lot of questions about who was investing in the technology, who was promoting it, what were the benefits, who would benefit, what were the risks, both short-term and long-term, to public health and the environment, who did the oversight. Do we have the right governance mechanisms and regulations in place? If something goes wrong, who do I call? And these were really hard questions. And I would say that the scientific community, a lot of the people we worked with in the government, didn't have immediate answers to these because we were dealing with a lot of novel science at that time, whether it's nanotech then, nanotech in the future, synthetic biology. So if we fast forward now to 2010, I think I've become a kind of guarded optimist because there is a lot of interesting activity going on at places like GAO, who actually took over the mantle of OTA somewhat, did a bunch of pilot projects, but I think is now ramping up to do sort of a much more aggressive push in this area. The White House Office of Science and Technology policy. So I'm actually much more optimistic than I was 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that makes this report by Dick even more crucial because I think it does provide kind of a foundation for us to start having a dialogue about if technology assessment is done in the country, in our country, it comes back in whatever form, what's it going to look like? And I think we need to have that conversation, whether it comes back in the Congress, outside the Congress, whether they're hybrid models, whatever. So I'm glad to have run into Dick, I think, 6 months ago. And it wasn't just Dick, but there's a whole group of people that have been spending a lot of time thinking about this, and you're going to meet them as we go on. And also, it's a privilege to have Paul Stern here, who's been an observer of this for decades now, provide some comments on Dick's report. So I'm going to hand it over to Dick. He's going to go through the presentation, and Paul will provide some comments, then we'll open up for Q&As, and then later on we'll move downstairs. We have a reception set up. I want to thank everybody that's worked on this report. We got the box of reports in this morning. Obviously, my staff did enormous amounts of work on this, as well as Dick and a lot of the people that have been working with us over the past 3 or 4 months. So, Dick?
A little embarrassing. Hello. I'm from the boondocks of Western Mass. They just explained to me how one of these things works, so if the slides are running backwards or something, you'll have to indulge me. Wow. So, first, what's the background problem or challenge that animates my report on reinventing technology assessment? It's a truism, but also a truth that science and technology are transforming our world at ever-accelerating rates. Obvious examples are the internet and genetic engineering, and now emerging areas like nanotechnology and synthetic biology, and perhaps geoengineering the Earth's climate. But the broad social repercussions of technological innovations are often not well understood until they become substantially entrenched. And by that I mean, by entrenched I mean pervasively established in ways that can be hard to alter or undo. Here are a few examples historically of tech systems that became entrenched and are at least arguably suboptimal. One is the skew of the U.S. healthcare system toward expensive, high-tech treatment of illness to the relative neglect of simpler, more economical, and effective preventive strategies. Another example is our energy system that is historically tilted toward production from non-renewable resources rather than relying on renewables and attention to energy efficiency improvements. And a third example would be our heavy dependence on the private automobile system compared with a more balanced mixture of automobiles, strong public transit, and bicycle lanes in parts of Europe. This kind of evolved entrenchment of technological systems can result in important lost opportunities, significant social and environmental costs, and channeling societal development down long-term unhealthy paths. There's both a danger and considerable irony here. We often hear that we live in a technological society or an information age, yet it turns out, upon reflection, that we lack adequate information about, of all things, the meaning and broad implications of science and technology. So how can our society address that lack and so ensure that our technological prowess more effectively advances key social objectives? Technology assessment, abbreviated TA, is a practice intended to enhance social understanding of the implications of science and technology and thereby to improve decision making. As Dave Rajewski mentioned, the idea and practice of technology assessment is not new. In 1972, the U.S. Congress set an important precedent by establishing an Office of Technology Assessment, the OTA, which was the first government TA agency in the world. Then in 1995, led by House Speaker Newt Gingrich, the Congress shut down the OTA. At the time, the arguments included that OTA produced studies too slowly relative to the pace of legislative decision-making, and also that OTA wasn't really needed because other institutions such as the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Research Service or the National Academy of Sciences complex could do technology assessment in place of the OTA. Meanwhile, during its 23-year lifespan, the OTA did not go unnoticed around the world. It became an inspiration to others, and there are now 18 technology assessment agencies operating in Europe. So another irony is that the U.S. has spurned what we have nonetheless inspired in others. Back to the U.S., since 1995, there have been repeated attempts to reopen the U.S. OTA, but all have so far failed in Congress. On the other hand, in 2008, Congress asked the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to establish a permanent technology assessment capability. For now, GAO anticipates producing 1 or 2 expert studies a year. That's less than 1/10 of the 20 to 30 studies that OTA produced annually, so not yet comparable in output to what existed 15 or even 25 years ago. So if there's a vital need for better informed decision-making on issues involving science and technology, does having a technology assessment capability actually address that need? That is, in actual practice, does TA lead to different, arguably improved societal outcomes? It occurred to me we can address that question by considering a kind of natural experiment. Europe has institutionalized a healthy range of technology assessment institutions during the past 15 years that the US has functioned without an OTA. So does it make a difference? Does TA make a difference? Have they made different decisions as a result? The answer is yes. Technology assessment has contributed to decisions by various European nations, the European Union, or both, to make different decisions than the US related to global warming, producing green technologies such as wind power, deciding which genetic technologies to pursue, and how manufactured chemicals are regulated. So summarizing this far, there is an important societal need for understanding the broad implications of science and technology and making better decisions, and technology assessment meaningfully addresses that need. Compared with 1995, when OTA shut down, the context for conducting technology assessment has changed, which establishes new possibilities for how TA is institutionalized and practiced. While greatly inspired by the OTA, European technology assessment agencies haven't slavishly emulated OTA's exact methods and procedures. OTA relied almost exclusively on technology assessment studies conducted by expert analysts with advice from representatives of organized stakeholder groups. And this general model of operation was established by the early 1980s. European TA agencies often use variations of OTA's approach because it works well, but they have also augmented it with many other practices, including effective methods that involve carefully structured participation by lay people, and that's called participatory technology assessment, or abbreviated PTA. Unlike the OTA, Europeans have also developed working relationships between university science, technology, and society programs, and technology assessment agencies, so that there's continual innovation in technology assessment concepts and methods. The internet is also altering how all kinds of institutions, not just TA agencies, are structured and operate, allowing new forms of decentralized and open collaboration, more transparency, and greater institutional agility. With multiple TA agencies in the world, transnational collaboration in TA is expanding, for example, through the European Parliamentary Technology Assessment Network. Overall, around the world, the practice of TA, including participatory TA, is increasingly widespread and influential. A bottom line at this point is that while the pace, complexity, and social significance of technological change are increasing, the US has only limited institutionalization of technology assessment and no standing capacity to conduct participatory TA or to integrate it into decision-making. We're left out of most international collaboration in TA practice, and unlike the Europeans, we don't have a systematic capacity to innovate in TA concepts and methods. I'm going to expand a bit on participatory TA, PTA, because it's widely acknowledged as the most significant development in TA practice in the years since OTA shut down. Why might participatory TA be a good idea, and what does it look like in practice? Does it mean that people who know nothing suddenly get to make key decisions about science and technology? OTA-style expert TA has an important contribution to make, but it's incomplete. In contrast, participatory TA gives a voice to everyday lay people whose consumer purchases and tax dollars pay for innovation, but whose perspectives are ordinarily left out of science and technology policy decisions. Participatory TA lets decision makers know their constituents' informed views. Participatory TA engages everyday lay people by involving them in balanced processes through which they become well-informed prior to rendering judgment. More on that in a moment. OTA, and now GAO's Technology Assessment Unit, work for and advise Congress. Participatory TA can directly inform government decision-making, but it's also often used to inform and stimulate wider societal discussion about policy issues involving science and technology. And that wider societal discussion can in turn feed back informally into the political system. When participatory TA is forward-looking, tackling emerging science and technology issues, European businesses have found that it can function helpfully as political risk assessment, allowing them to select research and innovation trajectories more likely to find broad public support and thus reducing costly downstream social controversy. The OTA and other expert TA often present itself as objective or value-free. My report argues that the idea that technology assessment can ever be value-free is an unhelpful illusion. The choice of problems we address, how we frame them, and our descriptive and explanatory categories are all value-influenced. For instance, if I'm a TA analyst, which aspects of a technology's influence will I examine? Do I focus on economic productivity, environmental impact, effect on gender relations, the quality of work, how a technology can alter the structure of power within a society, and so on. Deciding which questions is invariably informed by values. Compared with expert TA, it turns out that participatory TA commonly broadens the framing of issues and is more explicit and incisive in asking Todd Laporte to turn off his cell phone. It's more explicit and incisive in offering moral and ethical judgments. All of this makes for interesting possibilities for increasing the complementarity between expert TA and participatory TA. Expert TA provides essential input into participatory TA. Participatory TA can, in turn, stimulate, enrich, and inform follow-on expert TA. And I'll get to an example in a moment. What does participatory TA look like in practice? As an example, one of the more influential participatory TA methods was invented in Denmark, where it's called a consensus conference. Consensus conferences have been organized when the Danish Parliament will be addressing a complex issue involving science and technology and where conflicting social values are in play. The Danish TA agency, called the Danish Board of Technology, assembles a panel of about 15 lay participants who are recruited randomly to roughly reflect the national demographic profile. Experts and representatives of organized stakeholder groups active on the issue are excluded from the lay panel. All of the meetings of the lay panel are neutrally facilitated to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak, nobody dominates. The whole process is overseen by an ad hoc balanced committee of experts and stakeholders who disagree with each other and to ensure that no strong bias one way or the other is introduced into the process. The lay panel begins by attending 2 background preparatory weekends. For instance, if the topic involves genetic engineering, at the first background weekend, a high school biology teacher might be invited to come in and talk about some of the basics of modern genetic science. At the second background meeting, a journalist might be invited to come in and discuss who the important actors and institutions working the issue are. During these background meetings, the lay panel decides the subsidiary questions they want to address. Based on their questions, the Danish Board of Technology assembles a balanced panel of experts and knowledgeable stakeholders who typically disagree with each other. There's then a 2-day public forum in the Parliament building in which the lay panel takes testimony from and cross-examines that balanced panel of experts and stakeholders. The lay panel then retires and spends 1 day writing a report in their own words, and they present it the next morning at a national press conference in the Parliament building. The lay panel findings and recommendations are advisory, not binding. With further dissemination, the report informs and stimulates broad national discussion. In the past 2 decades, this process has been used 24 times in Denmark and dozens of times in at least 16 other nations. Consensus conferences in Denmark have been intended more to inform public discussion than to directly impact public policy. Nonetheless, they sometimes have influenced policy. For instance, consensus conferences held in the late 1980s influenced the Danish parliament to pass legislation limiting the use of genetic screening in hiring and insurance decisions and to prohibit food irradiation except for dry spices. After several Danish consensus conferences and hundreds of follow-on local debates on biotechnology, a study by the European Commission found that more Danes understood and supported their nation's biotech policies than did the citizens of other countries. Various participatory TA methods have been adapted, tested, and proven in the U.S. at least 16 times, mostly organized by universities. They demonstrate that U.S. citizens are able and willing to participate effectively in such processes. Here's one example. The photo shows the concluding public presentation by the lay panel of a 2006 Boston area consensus conference organized by faculty and students at BU School of Public Health. The topic was biomonitoring, a set of techniques for monitoring a human population for the presence of industrial chemicals in people's bodies. Biomonitoring raises a large number of kind of thorny ethical issues. For instance, if researchers discover traces of a chemical in a human population and it's not known whether the chemical poses a health risk, what's the researcher's obligation to communicate what they know and what they don't know? You want to give people information they need, but you don't want to necessarily cause unnecessary panic. When reading the final reports from consensus conferences, I've seen that lay panelists invariably rise to the occasion with enormous dedication, and their final reports offer illuminating and enriching perspective. It's true that expert analyses exhibit greater analytic depth and detail, but lay panel reports are normally written more engagingly and call attention to a wider range of social and ethical considerations. In the case at hand, by happy coincidence, the Boston Consensus Conference on Biomonitoring ran concurrently with the National Research Council expert study on the same topic. That gives us another natural experiment, in this case on how expert and lay and participatory TA compare with one another. Comparing the two reports, it struck me that expert and lay TA studies, by framing sub-issues somewhat differently and reaching somewhat different conclusions, importantly complement and enrich one another's analyses. I'm not alone in that judgment. The chairman of the National Research Council's biomonitoring study was in the audience that day in Boston, and you can read that he was surprised and impressed by the lay panel's performance. Here's a sample conclusion from the Boston Consensus Conference. The lay panel expressed the hope that biomonitoring data that reveals a growing concentration of potentially harmful chemicals in a human population could be used to stimulate safer chemical and industrial processes and new green businesses with corresponding job growth. Academic researchers subsequently determined that that recommendation was novel and important. It wasn't an idea suggested to the lay panel by the experts and stakeholders who testified to them, and it also wasn't an idea that the academic researchers found mentioned in the expert literature on biomonitoring. So it's an original and interesting recommendation, but it was 1 or 2 sentences. It wasn't fleshed out. So that lay panel recommendation could potentially become a fruitful topic for follow-on expert technology assessment analysis, exemplifying the potential for complementarity between expert and participatory TA. There have been about a dozen local or regional variants of consensus conferences in the United States. There was also one at national scale on nanotechnology and human enhancement. That one took place in 2008 with 74 lay participants gathered at 6 sites across the United States, combining face-to-face deliberation with intervening online meetings, both among the lay panels at the 6 sites and with experts. A more recent participatory TA example is Worldwide Views on Global Warming. This was the first participatory TA project that took place at global scale. The green areas on the global map show the 38 nations that were represented in Worldwide Views. Each nation had one or more sites where approximately 90 randomly chosen lay participants gathered for face-to-face deliberation. This took place simultaneously around the world this past September 26th. It involved 4,000 citizens worldwide. The U.S. had 5 meeting sites. The upper right photo shows a balanced and diverse group of lay participants from the greater Boston region deliberating at the Museum of Science in Boston. As to the growing influence of participatory TA, Worldwide Views results were delivered to delegates to the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen, and the results were taken seriously into account at cabinet or presidential level in at least 9 nations that we know of. At the lower left, you see ambassadors from 5 nations, including China and India, discussing the Worldwide Views results at a public forum in the Danish Parliament. At this point, you might be wondering, what does all this stuff cost? The data in this table I've adjusted to $2009. You can see in the top horizontal line that OTA, expert TA studies cost about $700,000 to $1.4 million. The U.S. National Citizens Technology Forum, that's the national scale PTA process on nanotech and human enhancement I spoke about a moment ago, involves 74 lay people face-to-face at 6 sites, cost about $500,000, so a little bit less than an OTA expert study used to cost. I estimate that a national Danish-style consensus conference in the U.S., bringing 24 lay people together 3 times to a single site for face-to-face meetings, would cost between $400,000 and $800,000, depending on how many bells and whistles you added. That cost could be less than that range if some or all of the process could be done online. The cost of national-scale participatory technology assessment could go up or down, depending on process characteristics, but the participatory processes shown here cost roughly on the order of what expert TA costs, and they provide important social benefits that complement the benefits provided by expert TA. For comparison, a national consensus conference in a large European nation costs about $300,000, somewhat less than it would in the US because you don't have to fly people in over such large distances. Worldwide Views on Global Warming was intentionally designed to scale economically to the global scale. 38 nations were represented, covering 6 continents for about 3.5 million. That's still an estimate. I think it's high. So that implies that for 5 or 10 times the cost of doing such a process in one country, it was able to scale up to 38 countries. At the bottom, I show several large-scale deliberative processes that have been applied to various public policy issues, but not specifically to complex science and tech issues. The America Speaks 21st Century Town Meeting and the deliberative poll devised by James Fishkin are relatively well known in the US. As the table shows, they're also at the high end in cost. Comparing processes with different purposes and characteristics in a single table involves some apple and oranges comparison. I've included the bottom non-technology assessment examples only to show by contrast that the blue participatory TA examples at the top and the beige high-end deliberation examples near the bottom show that it's possible to organize participatory TA at national scale relatively economically. From analyzing the growing need and new possibilities for technology assessment, my report proposes criteria for a 21st century TA capability in the US. It's important to include both expert and participatory capabilities. When OTA was established in 1972, it made sense that it was in a brick-and-mortar building up on Capitol Hill. But a modern TA capability can use the internet to seek improved efficacy and cost efficiency via geographically distributed, agile, and collaborative structure. 6 years after OTA closed, Roger Herdman, the last director, commented quote, "The internet was just beginning when OTA stopped. It's astounding to think of what a new OTA could do in terms of information, productivity, and interactivity." Like the OTA or GAO, any new TA agency should seek structures to ensure that the institution is nonpartisan. But individual projects should welcome and openly integrate diverse value perspectives in a balanced way. TA that strives to look value-free tends to be TA that is impoverished and that is either unaware of or failing to disclose its unavoidable value-informed analytic choices. Congress can benefit importantly from technology assessment, but there's no strong reason that Congress should be the sole recipient or client. Within the limits of resource constraints, a modern TA capability can be responsive to and seek to inform other branches of national government, state and local governments, decision-making within the private sector, and the wider society. My report identifies a number of general ways that technologies can profoundly affect a society, but that current TA methods, both expert and participatory, don't yet fully grasp. Hence, a 21st century TA capability needs to innovate continuously in TA concepts and methods. In terms of these criteria, a TA capability within Congress is valuable but not sufficient. For instance, while there are some individual analysts at GAO, some of whom are in this room, and also in the National Research Council, some of whom are in this room, who are interested in participatory TA, those institutions have long-standing report preparation and review procedures that would require substantial overhaul before they would be able to conduct participatory TA. It's not clear those institutions are prepared to make such significant procedural changes, at least in the near term. In the aftermath of OTA's demise, it will be difficult for any congressional TA agency to take risks involved in being continuously innovative in TA concepts and methods. In contrast, a new TA institution independent of Congress, by operating outside of the direct line of fire of polarized congressional politics, could be more innovative. Any congressional TA agency is going to be held on a tight leash, required to focus on serving congressional needs. In contrast, an independent TA institution could work on behalf of other clients, include public education as part of its mission, and have the flexibility to collaborate easily in transnational TA projects. Considering alternative models for a new TA institution, I and colleagues from several other institutions, some of whom are here today, have come to focus especially on the idea of establishing an institutional network model for conducting technology assessment. The network would be independent of government, and rather than operating at a single brick-and-mortar site, would comprise a geographically distributed network of complementary institutions. Within the network, we envision roles for core institutions of three kinds, as shown on the slide. The idea of an institutional network model builds off of multi-site, multi-institutional, and transnational technology assessment projects, including two I've mentioned, the National Consensus Conference on Nanotech and Human Enhancement, and Worldwide Views on Global Warming. Within the network, nonpartisan policy research organizations have established avenues of interaction with policymakers and the capability to disseminate results broadly. Universities can contribute in many ways, including by conducting both expert TA analysis and participatory TA projects, and developing and evaluating new TA concepts and methods. Science museums excel in public education and broadly informing societal understanding in user-friendly ways. In fact, we've taken a few initial steps past academically exploring an institutional network model and begun to plan the actual creation of such a network. The proposed network has a name, Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology Network, and of course, it has to have a logo. We envision that ECAST will gradually expand to become nationwide in scope. The founding partners in ECAST include the Science and Tech Innovation Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, We envision the Wilson Center as a central coordinating node for the ECAST network. It's advantageous because Wilson interacts routinely with Congress and the executive branch, and it can serve as a participatory technology assessment demonstration site for federal government staff, relatively few of whom have heard of participatory TA, and none of whom, as far as I know, have seen it in action. And if you ever get a chance to see it in action, it's quite impressive and even pretty moving. The Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes at Arizona State University is a leading university-based science policy unit represented here today by Mahmoud Farouk. The Boston Museum of Science is widely admired, as is their two staff people here, David Sittenfeld and Larry Bell. Darlene Cavalier from Science Cheerleader helped initiate the collaboration among the founding partners of ECAST. I'm from the nonprofit Loca Institute, and I'd like to invite the others I just named and Dave Rajeski to turn a moment, stand and face the audience so that if you want during the reception afterwards, you'll know who you want to schmooze with. ECAST is in an early planning stage, but we've had a chance to discuss the idea with people at 11 other universities and 5 other leading science museums across all regions of the country, all of whom quickly expressed support and interest in becoming involved. Just for a sense of their diversity, among those 16 additional institutions is Georgia Tech, Colorado School of Mines, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and among museums, the Exploratorium in San Francisco, the Fort Worth Museum of Science in Texas, and the umbrella organization, the Association of Science and Technology Centers. We've also met with GAO's Technology Assessment Group, who are receptive to exploring possibilities for a collaborative relationship with ECAST. The founding institutions in ECAST, as well as the other institutions where we found supportive interest, include leading U.S. scholars of technology assessment, practitioners of technology foresight, personnel from a half-dozen leading science museums with experience in organizing public forums on science and technology issues, and people who have initiated and organized all of the U.S. participatory technology assessment projects discussed in my report. So while ECAST at this point is an intention more than a reality, the people and institutions involved have an impressive record of accomplishment in technology assessment and participatory TA. We don't see the ECAST network as a mutually exclusive alternative to other U.S. TA actors, such as the GAO, the National Academy of Science Complex, or a congressional OTA, should that ever be reborn. GAO and the National Academy have demonstrated competence in conducting certain types of expert technology assessment analysis and delivering the results to their congressional or other federal clients. As we envision it, ECAST will have the capability to flexibly complement those activities, including, as I've said, through conducting participatory TA, conducting TA on behalf of a wider range of clients, more broadly informing societal discussion on S&T issues, innovating in technology assessment concepts and methods, and participating easily in transnational technology assessment projects. My conclusion is that given the dynamism and sweeping influence of contemporary science and technology, the new organizational forms and participatory capabilities made possible in part by the Internet, the accomplishments of European technology assessment over the past 2 decades, not to mention that we currently have an executive branch of government that wants to advance citizen engagement in governance. The time is ripe to integrate a modern, expert, and participatory TA capability into our nation's civic life. Thank you.
Paul, why don't we go to you, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Have any slides? Okay. As it probably says in my bio, I work at the National Research Council. I've been there for a long time. I became interested in the kind of process that Dick has thought so carefully about through a series of projects that had risk assessment in their names, or risk analysis, or something like that over a long period of time, risk communication. The word risk was always there. The word technology was not so prominently there. But a key one of those studies was a study called Understanding Risk that came out in 1996 as a result of a study where the Academy was asked to advise on how to characterize risk. And that was initially understood to be an analytic activity where you take a lot of data and you summarize it in some way and make it intelligible to decision makers. As we got into the study, it became clear that things were much more complicated than that. That, as Dick points out, there are values hiding around every corner. Starting with asking the question that gets put to the analyst. What that study came to call problem formulation. That there are values in problem formulation, there are values in deciding what analytic methods to use. Benefit cost analysis assumes usually that you can monetize everything that matters and that you can add them together somehow using some kind of an algorithm. There's all kinds of hidden values. So at the end of that study, we came to the conclusion that even to understand risk, you needed a process that included analysis, but that put it in a context of deliberation involving what that study called the range of interested and affected parties to the decision. So it all comes into the context of decision making, and you need deliberation to figure out what questions to ask. As that study said, of course it's important to get the science right, but first you have to get the right science. And that's not an analytic question. So you need both analysis and deliberation to frame the decision, to formulate the problem, to identify all of the potential consequences of the action, or in this case, the technology that's being developed, to systematically consider what's known about the potential consequences in light of all of the values of all of the parties that might be affected, including future generations for some things. And you need both analysis and deliberation to incorporate new information and new concerns as they come along and reanalyze and reconsider. And that study pointed to what they call an iterative, analytic, deliberative process as the way to go. Perfectly in sync with the kind of thing that Dick is talking about. A number of years later, another group at the NRC that I was involved in produced this study, brought this one in. It's called Public Participation in Environmental Assessment and Decision Making. And it basically reviewed the literature and tried to draw conclusions about what happens if you do public participation, what forms of public participation have what kinds of effects under what conditions, and tried to come up with some recommendations about whether and when and how to do public participation in environmental assessment and decision making, and that includes technology assessment. And it came up with, first of all, a conclusion that if you do it right, it helps to have public participation. And doing it right means following a set of principles, beginning with transparency of the information and analysis, explicit attention to both facts and values, explicitness about assumptions and uncertainties in analysis, independent review of analysis or collaborative inquiry, and again, iteration. So again, the same sort of a notion that Dick is writing about. And I would add to the results of the NRC studies that this kind of a process is especially important for new and emerging technologies where you don't even know what questions to ask yet. You need a process, and nobody knows what questions to ask. If you got a group of general citizens and you ask them about nanotechnology, their first question is, what's that? Probably. At least it was a few years ago. As the technology emerges, people don't know anything about it. And the first people who are likely to raise concerns that require analysis are going to be a subset of the scientists and technologists who develop the new technology. But once they start to raise questions, you can start to have a process of interaction. I mean, the implicit notion of a technology assessment, even a participatory one, that's one-off, is a bit simplistic. You know, and I don't think you really mean that, but it sounded like that for your presentation. You do it once and then it's all assessed. Well, it can't be like that. It's emerging, it changes. But what you can get is you do a process like this, and it needs to be interactive, and the models that you're talking about are like that. And they're not the only possible models, where you have a select group of lay people that exclude stakeholders and they get to interrogate experts. It's a model that makes sense. It's not the only possibility. But it's particularly important to do it as technologies are emerging, because you don't know at first which values might be at stake, which scientific questions to ask, which is why you need to do this more than once. And through a process like this, you can start to get a more intelligent problem formulation, and you can start, and Dick was alluding to this in his talk, one of the things that happens with new technologies fairly frequently, and the prime example is nuclear energy, is concerns get raised. Technology moves ahead like a freight train, and it gets stopped by public opposition when concerns come up that hadn't been adequately attended to. In some cases, it might have been possible to attend to them adequately, but it didn't happen. Anyway, not to talk very much longer, read Dick's report. Think about Dick's report. I think that the general kind of approach that he's advocating is something that fits well with everything that we know about risk characterization, risk assessment, public participation, and so forth, except that you need to add the iteration in. It doesn't have to be done by the same group over and over again. I mean, it's part of a process. And there are a lot of questions about how it should be done, some of which are discussed in the report and that need further discussion. I mean, it's clear from the report that there are many possible ways to do them, and you don't have to pick one and stick with it. And in fact, my final word on this is that what we need to do is try it out and collect the data. Consider this a social experiment, invest in the social experiment, and invest in evaluation of the process and the outcomes. And what I think is that there needs to be a lot of discussion about some ways to do it and some ways to try it out and ways to evaluate it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, we have half an hour or so for questions. We're webcasting, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. And if you could just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, and we'll start. Todd, do you want to?
Thank you. My name is Todd Laporte. I'm a faculty member at the School of Public Policy at George Mason University. And I will have to take my answer off the air because I have to leave to go teach at 4:30 class on technology, organizations, and culture. I have three concerns after giving my full endorsement to the report. Dick, you've done a terrific job of pulling a lot of strands together. And I want to thank Paul for his remarks, too, which I think dovetail quite nicely with my own concerns. The concerns that I have are these three. One is the tactics of reestablishing a technology assessment capability inside an institution that has a predilection to being hostile to this kind of enterprise, that is the U.S. Congress, at least in terms of its internal organizational structure. That's the first concern. broadly, if we tried it and it failed, then does that kill the technology assessment capability, the prospects for any kind of technology assessment capability in Congress for forever? Having tried it twice, it will probably never be politically, it would be too politically radioactive for anybody to mention it again. The second concern has to do with the fragility of institutional arrangements that are virtual. Paul Light at New York University and a number of other people have worried for some time about a declining institutional capability to do analysis in public organizations across time. The last 2 or 3 decades, OTA's closure was a signal event in that secular decline in our ability to think very far into the future. And the promise of virtual organizations, I fear, has not been adequately tested in terms of its ability, the ability of those institutions to conduct long-term institutional activities without risks of fragmentation or lack of adequate institutional support. And the third concern has to do with the an explicit comparison between the United States and Europe in many matters of comparative public policy is one that has some, I think, some important characteristics that are important to recognize and analyze, that individual European countries or even the European community or European Union as a whole have very different institutional arrangements in terms of governance, participatory or otherwise. Parliamentary systems in Europe are different than representative democracies in the United States, and coming to understand much more clearly what the implications of those differences are would be critical to the establishment of the sort of enterprise that is being described here. And a fourth concern is not really a concern as much as an endorsement of Paul's suggestion that we should be thinking a great deal about decision-making and risk rather than technology. I find with my students that technology is almost always enthusiastically and uncritically endorsed, whereas risk and specific technologies are people are much more critical in their analytic frames. So that ways of thinking about engaging the public by reframing the question of what it is we're studying might engender some more successful efforts to try to institutionalize the activity. I'm really sorry, having launched those 4 things, I have to go. So
it'll be when you can see the recording later.
I'll see the recording later. It'll be like the World Series game that I saw the first pitch of but couldn't stick around to see the end of. So anyway, I'm really sorry to leave. This is a really exciting conversation. I want to thank you for having it.
Shall I?
Why don't you start? Yeah.
I've never had it so easy. I mean, usually, you have to be really clever about how to duck the questions. But when the questioner leaves the room, it's so easy. I mean, on the first one, to remind you, Todd's first question was about a question about the tactics of reestablishing technology assessment within Congress, and a concern that if you fail twice, it would be failure forever. But that question perplexed me, what he was talking about, because ECAST is proposed as independent of Congress, so it doesn't really apply to ours. And on the other hand, Congress has already decided to reestablish a permanent technology assessment capability in the GAO. So it's a done deal. Congress is doing it. They might possibly later decide to reopen the OTA, but they've already asked the GAO to do it. So it's kind of a moot point. Again, on the fragility of virtual relations, I'm not too concerned about it. The GAO is going to be doing technology assessment non-virtually. ECAST will try to do it through a network. So we'll have a nice natural experiment and see if it's fragile or not. I mean, I've been involved with various types of networked institutional activities for 15 years, and they haven't proven particularly fragile. So I'm not concerned. On the other hand, could be, and it can be trial and error, you learn, but also the capabilities for virtual interaction are improving. I mean, when video teleconferencing, as that gets gradually better and cheaper and more ubiquitous, it may make it easier to do. I think that's enough of a reply.
I'd like to say one thing on this.
Yeah.
That Todd's question about Congress does raise a very important issue, I think, in an indirect sort of way. And that is the question of how could or would a participatory technology assessment process or set of institutions influence the political process at the national level in the United States. You can run these things, but who's going to listen? And that really is a critical kind of question, and it also relates to the business of virtual institutions. The kind of a network that you set up could continue, but if you want to establish a level of credibility for participatory technology assessment as a process, and you have it operated by 47 different organizations around the country with different provenance and different levels of credibility, it doesn't help with the problem of how do you get credibility in the national political system. I don't know the answer to that, but I think he's put his finger on an important problem. You can do it, and somebody can say, well, we don't trust that.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that it's always been a challenge for regular technology assessment or at National Academy of Science Studies to be influential at the national level.
Which is exactly the point, but sometimes it is.
Right.
I mean, the National Academies has a pretty good brand name.
Right.
And, usually doesn't get, it gets ignored frequently.
Right.
It usually doesn't get rejected as worthless. I mean, sometimes you have to push it under the table or make believe you don't know it's there. This has got a different kind of problem.
I think that we have an interesting model, though, because it's not a purely virtual institution network. It's a network of real brick and mortar places like science museums and this building. And so in terms of the participatory, actually we're potential. I mean, it's really interesting. I don't know how much impact it will have, but I think it's an interesting possibility, this ECAS thing. For instance, we've got the Wilson Center, which means that we can, if we're doing a multi-site participatory TA exercise, there will be a node here. We can invite congressional or White House staff to come in and see it and taste it and smell it. We have national media here. We have a better chance of that. At the same time, if we've got science museums who are active on this, we have multiple avenues of impact that aren't usually available. Because if we did a process with 10 or 12 institutions, half of which were science museums, which have strong outreach capabilities, no one's actually tried that before. I think it's a really promising thing to try in terms of impact.
The other thing to say on this is that one of the ways that the NRC brand establishes its value is through the process that it uses. That it has a process of peer reviewing and careful selection of participants and reviewing of documents and all of that stuff that makes it slow and expensive. But establishes credibility, and it's a thing to think about. In an enterprise like this one, is to the extent that you can establish a process that's credible, you build the credibility of the entire operation. Now that goes against there's a tension between that and trying to find the process that's credible, which takes some learning by doing. But okay, we should let other people talk.
Let's take some more questions. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm John Piha with Carnegie Mellon University and the Federal Communications Commission. I think bringing together many institutions and a diversity of institutions has a lot of great advantages. I've written a little about that myself, but it immediately brings some hard questions up about organization. On one extreme, I could imagine a very loose confederation of organizations, each with roughly the same objectives, similar methodologies, saying what they want. At the other side, I could imagine a very tightly controlled system with some centralized body that maintains firm editorial control, farms work out, or anything in between? No matter where you sit, there are some challenges along that spectrum. I'm wondering how do you see that working?
We're having a working session tomorrow where we'll continue that conversation. No, those are great questions, and we're at an early stage. We don't have the solid answers to those yet. Do you have anything you want to say, Dave?
No, I think I think you work some of that out. I mean, I also think a lot of that happens through actually trying stuff. You know, and I think you can kind of intellectually think it through as much as you want, but a lot of the sort of bumps in the road have to actually be felt by driving the car over them. So I think actual, trying this out, doing some prototype experiments, are going to be critical to sort of figuring out exactly how to set the institutional framework up. But I do think it has to be addressed early, because the worst thing to do is, I think, early on to kind of show that there's a sense of confusion. Or it gets back to this issue that Paul raised about there isn't a solid process here for essentially sorting out conflicting ends and means.
Beth Novick's had her hand up since the beginning.
Beth.
Another one of those question askers who has to leave, so that's advantageous to you, perhaps. Beth Novick, United States Deputy CTO. So I'm here because, and I should say, by the way, and this is as a tribute to you, of whose work I've been a fan for a long time, this is the first lecture I've attended that I wasn't speaking at least a year. And I'm here very much because, for precisely this reason, is that we at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and as part of the leadership of the National Science and Technology Council, the interagency cabinet-level council on science and technology policy, has put out a forward-looking commitment to say we want to get back of doing participatory technology assessment within the executive branch. We know we need to do this, and we want to understand the best mechanisms for how to do it. So I wanted to come out as a supporter of the study that you're undertaking, and to also ask you if you can help us to think through some of these issues going forward. Particularly, we've been looking at and interested in the intersection between what you've been talking about, technology assessment, participatory technology assessment, like the Danish Consensus Council model that's a sort of deliberative citizen participation exercise, and the world of expert networking, which looks a little bit different in terms of using, and there's clearly a slide is coming, I see, that may help to bring down a lot of the costs that you've mentioned in your framework here, help us to tap more quickly the networks of people, and again, the kind of virtual network that you've thought about creating. So we've been talking to and looking at, and really just at the beginning of this process, a number of different networks. There's interest from many that I've talked to who have, again, sort of virtual networks, if you will, who have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of S&T professionals who are interested in getting involved and finding a way that they can participate. So I'm wondering just if you have any reflections now off the bat, and invite you to make this an ongoing conversation, please, if we can start to think about how we kind of perhaps find the middle ground that combines OTA, PTA, and the expert networking techniques that allow a lot of experts to participate potentially faster and more cheaply, and create new ways of getting involved.
Right. Well, we're very eager to participate in that conversation. I think I won't use the slide because the slide was that I put together is a comparison of the open collaboration processes and peer-to-patent type processes you've done with participatory TA, and that's not what you're really talking about, because this would be a side-by-side comparison, and you're talking about, how can we hybridize?
I think the question is how to do all of the above, what the hybrid model looks at. There's its advantage of some of the tools to do the TA part of things as well as the PTA part of things. So
we're very interested in doing that, and nobody on the planet yet knows how to do that. So that because it's cutting edge, and we're very excited to work on that.
So the fact that I'm leaving is not a reflection on the answer; it's only a reflection on the great impact. But I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. I won't do the table because I don't think it's relevant to the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Walter Stavlo. I'm Director of International Relations at the Association of Science Technology Centers. This is one of the organizations that you've mentioned will support the initiative, and I will confirm that here, even if after this being said, I'm going to come up with 4 questions about the initiative that I think should be on the table. As you can hear, I'm not from Arizona or Boston. I'm from Europe, and I'm here since 4 years. And so from that point of view, I'd like to make 4 remarks about what you have said, and that may be some problems in the implementation of the program. First thing is that my experience with the US scientific community and universities is that this community is still in what we call Europe the PUS model, the public understanding of science model, which is also called the deficit model, which means basically that if the public does not understand anything about technology, the more you communicate to them, the better they're going to understand and going to support you, which is different from the situation in Europe that we call the public engagement with science, where people are really involved in the dialogue. And also I think that one of the partners, which is the scientific community here, needs to be convinced in a strong way about this participatory practices, because I don't think that they are at the same level yet than they were in Europe. So there is a real effort to be done with the scientific community as well. The second remark is that, well, going back to what has been said before, is the illusion of the decision. Something that, you know, you need to really describe the process, how what you discuss is going to be effect and have an impact. Because if you don't do that, after a while, you have the risk that there is that people get that there is a disillusion about the outcomes. And so there's things that we have seen in Denmark as well. So really the illusion of the decision making. This is never going to replace the democratic process. You cannot have 50 science cafes who are going to replace a debate at Congress or something like that. So
Nor does it aspire to.
No, I know, but I mean, just to make clear what I mean. If scientists have a paper that is refused or whatever, or the National Academy of Science or whatever, it's one thing. But if the public sees that the efforts that they do to try to participate in a thing like that do not go anywhere, you know, the result is really bad. So you should avoid that. One thing that we have seen in Europe as well, and as a problem, is that at the same time, if you create the discussion and the dialogue, European Union had to promote what they call the precautionary principle. And, you know,
I'm sorry, could you...
The precautionary principle?
I missed the sentence before.
Oh, well, at the same time, if all this technology assessment and participatory programs went to Europe, they had to also disclose the idea and the concept of the precautionary principle, which is a very difficult thing, because it seems that it's conflictual. The precautionary principle say that, well, you may not do some kind of research because you don't know where it's going to lead to. Something that the scientific community is really trying to avoid in many ways. And people would say, well, if our ancestors, Neanderthalers or whatever, would have to apply the precautionary principle, you know, that we would never have fire or the wheel, invented the wheel. So, and how do you going to deal with that? What is the conflict between, you know, these kind of problems with the research and the discussion? So, yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
We respond. Well, on the first point about the challenge of institutions here that are operating on the public understanding of science model, the deficit model, the idea that we know the answers and the purpose of a participatory exercise is to get the public to agree with that answer. I think that's the institutions we're working with don't operate on that model. And we're just, I think that, you know, we're still working out what this network, we're at a very early stage in this network, but in my head is the idea that if you're operating on that model, it's really not a good fit to be in this network. and it's not like we don't have institutions and people to work with who have a different model. So, you know, I think we can work around that. We've got a social base to work with in this country, and I mean an institutional base. There are, for instance, you mentioned universities in this country operate on the deficit model, but there are 11 universities in this country where people have organized these types of participatory processes, and clearly they do not operate on the deficit model, and all of them have said they would like to be part of the ECAS network. On the issue of the impact, and it is important, the participatory TA projects, the 16 I've discovered so far that happened in this country, there may have been more I haven't yet discovered, they were all mostly organized as university demonstration projects. They were testing the method. They weren't trying to have an impact. But it's true, if you keep doing that and inviting people to put their heart, their scarce time into it, and there isn't some type of result, there would be disillusionment. On the other hand, actually, even though it's mostly been demonstration projects, even the ones done which were not done with the favorable institutional circumstances we're trying to create in ECAS, for instance, having the science museums and having a node like the Wilson Center in Washington. Even without that, some of our participatory TA processes did have impact. A couple of our PTA processes did influence the deliberations in Congress on legislation, and worldwide views, which we participated in, did have some impact. So, but you're right that it's crucial that we attend to that in a very serious way, or there would be disillusionment. I'm not sure what to say about the precautionary question. Did you? I didn't fully understand what the question in the comment was.
I have a comment of some sort related to that. You know, I mean, what I heard you saying was the issue was the precautionary principle applied to research and development of technology.
Are you saying it applied to technology assessment or applied to the development of technology?
Applied to the development of technology.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that is, you know, I mean, it is a conundrum. I've had to face it a little bit in the context of climate geoengineering. You know, where you have some technologies that have, with some unknown probability, some catastrophic potential. And if you know, the farther along you proceed with doing research on them, the more likely it is that somebody might implement them, you know, regardless of, you know, might take that risk. And it's the sort of thing that, you know, the risk is borne by everybody on the planet, and it can be taken by a few. You know, so the only thought that I have about that, and it's something that could be a subject of a PTA kind of activity, is that is to create a set of institutions for governance of the research. You know, I mean, there's one thing about institutions for governance of the development, but for something like this, you know, it seems to me that you need to think about institutions for governance of the research so that the people who are doing the research are already part of a normative system, which makes it more likely that you'll be able to control the impulse to move from research to development too soon. But it's, you know, it's a really bad problem, and it is something that you could take up in a PTA context and see if you could get some other better ideas.
You mean a PTA process that would be designing an institution for the
A
system for the governance of research?
How should you deal with research on geoengineering? Yeah, to discuss how do you govern the research.
I mean, I think the one thing I would say that you saw in Europe going back at least a decade is that as they started to move away from the public understanding of science model, they also started implementing this idea of upstream governance. Okay, so the two sort of went this way, that you started to begin to have those discussions about the ethics of research, the applicability of the research to large-scale impacts much further upstream. You know, the old TA model tended to have them way downstream. And I think that's another thing that's actually key to this working, is you're moving the dialogue upstream with the scientist, with the researchers. Right. Mike, you got a question?
Mike Nelson. I'm a professor at Georgetown University, but in past lives I worked on the Hill on the Senate Science Subcommittee and used a lot of OTA reports while there was an OTA, and then went to the White House. And what I observed, both on the Hill and at the White House, was that OTA usually was looking at the big picture. And the process you described sounds like the participatory process would look at the whole field, and it would, you know, provide some constraints on what policy could be, but it really wouldn't answer the policymaker's question, which I kept hearing all the time, which is, okay, what do I do? You know, it put some bounds on the decision, but it didn't really say, you know, here's the game plan. The good thing about the process you're describing is it would happen a lot faster than the OTA process, but it really wouldn't get public participation inside the decision-making loop, where people are actually developing the detailed options and really get to that point. Now, OTA, I'm a soccer fan, but let me use a football analogy. OTA would do these studies that would help a football team decide whether to, you know, do the running plays or the focus on the passing game. And unfortunately, often the result only came in at the third quarter or so. The politicians really wanted to know what play to play from the very start. And every time OTA tried to do that, they got some people very happy with them because they liked the play, and they got a lot of other people who were really dissatisfied. And so that was one of the reasons they went out of existence. But my question here is, how do we get this, how could we make this process work in a more real-time, more detailed manner that would really help the politicians make those choices that have to be made when the regulation and the laws are being drafted?
There are at least 20 people in this room who would have really interesting answers to that question. But, I mean, a piece of it is we have had opportunities to talk to congressmen, and I mean, in my experience is the last thing that they want from a participatory process is to be told exactly what to do and take away from them what they were elected to do. I mean, if for what it's worth, in a participatory process, I mean, OTA made the tactical decision to always have 3 or 4 recommendations and here are the consequences of each, and we're not going to tell Congress which they should do. That was a tactical decision. Sometimes it was pretty transparent that they thought one of those decisions was the right one, but they never said it normally. Participatory TA, just empirically, when you look at it, typically is much more incisive than that. The citizen participants are usually not restrained about saying exactly what they think should happen and what their values are and how they're affected. Sometimes they can reach consensus. Sometimes there might be dissenting footnotes or a majority-minority report, but individually and collectively, they're pretty darn clear. Where it's going to be deficient, at least with, say, the process that one example, as Paul said, there are other models, but that model I was talking about at the Danish Consensus Conference, an OTA report was 300 pages long. A consensus conference is going to produce a 7 to 15-page document. It won't have the minutia of detail. So their values will be clear, and they'll express them directly. It won't be an articulated, piece of legislation. It would be up to somebody else to decide how to take that into account along with other considerations.
I mean, that's where I'm asking the question: how do you get participatory input at that second stage?
It is, yeah.
Trying to decide, do I do it this way, or that way?
It is a second stage. Technology assessment, by its nature, I think, at least most people think of that as being an early stage. Technology is fairly new. There's decision making at a lot of stages after that. In this public participation report, for example, most of the examples were not technology assessment examples. They were at later stages. I mean, you can have public participation in regulatory decision making. I mean, EPA could say, all right, we're going to reauthorize we're going to reconsider a decision on exposure to toxic X in drinking water, and you could have a participatory process. Sometimes they go off the reservation, and sometimes they should. They say one of the examples that was in the Understanding Risk report, was the Medfly case from California back in whenever it was, and they said, well, we're going to tell people how to stay indoors while we spray for the medflies, and you get a process open up, and somebody says, well, it's not that it's a local infestation. The whole state is full of them. Spraying is not the answer. What to tell people to do when you spray is the wrong question. And that happens in a participatory process if you get enough people around the table, or it can. But that's not PTA, it's P something else.
There's something that I'm thinking of
principles
that I've heard. I don't think anyone's done it. I mean, part of the answer could be what you were talking about, iterative processes, where that means more expense, but you keep moving along and repeating the process. Another thing that happens spontaneously, but that people have talked about, hasn't been institutionalized a lot. There was one of these pilot consensus conferences in the U.S. was done by University of Wisconsin-Madison about 5 years ago on nanotech. And these particular processes, usually you get the lay panel together, they learn a whole lot, and then they're gone. In this case, the lay panel sort of said, well, we learned all this. We think this now is really important. We don't want to go away. And so they started hanging around, and eventually the Wisconsin researchers said, well, I guess we better help you. And so they have a website, and they've been going for 5 years later. They're still all, articulating all the time what they think about nanotech. So you could imagine, and other people have proposed this, instead of having to be a one-off deal, that it's just done. Well, then I think what you're saying is then as you go into deliberations in Congress or into subsequent implementation, there are many subsequent stages where you're at a different stage, and the judgments made at the beginning are no longer applicable to the new decisions that have to be made. So one possibility would be to iterate along the lines Paul said. Another would be to take a group and have them not disband. And bring them back. Either they meet, they kind of have a virtual community, or you reassemble them 8 months later. That would be, this is actually kind of, well, on the one hand, participatory TA has been done for 25 years. We're not yet consolidated into best practice. I mean, in fact, almost every time anybody does one of these, they do something new, because you keep seeing new ways to tweak it, to learn from the last one. And so I think there are possibilities that are interesting for having to be, maybe experimenting with having to be a more sustained activity.
To be able to respond to proposals, I think that's what would motivate people to get more engaged if there were trial balloons that came out. And I agree this may not be technology assessment, but technology is moving so fast that even at very early stages, people are making decisions that will influence the next 5 or 10 years in the development of technology.
Yeah, I mean, when we were doing these continual focus groups on nanotech, one of the early questions, which was a very broad social one, is whether we should put a moratorium on the research. Always comes up, right? And against that question was this issue of let industry sort of regulate themselves. So these focus groups, we sort of tested the propositions, and there was very little support for either one. And we were able to get people into kind of a middle ground where we asked them what they want. Well, they wanted transparency. They wanted more pre-market testing. As this went on, we were able then to sort of focus on, if you want transparency, do you mean labels? Right? So that was the next iteration of policy questions that were coming out. So I think, you have this ability, but it's very dependent on this capacity to iterate. And this going back to the policymakers and sort of saying, well, what's on the table now? What's going to be decided? What's in the next sort of, and the ability to then, because we used a lot of that information and went up when we were called to testify. Yeah. But it was sort of anticipating what the next round of questions was going to be and actually inserting that into processes that would give people some feedback.
The science advice is only as good as the advisee.
Right.
And the timing.
The timing is critical, right? We've reached the end of 4:30. I'd like to thank both Paul and Dick and all of you, and we're going to move downstairs because we have some refreshments set up for you, and we can continue the conversation down there. Thank you.